During the 1960s and 70s, the United States faced two wars, one in Vietnam and the other on the home front. History was written as young men from all around the country were drafted into service and sent overseas to fight in Southeast Asia. On the war front, the U.S.'s undertaking of their responsibility to defend Vietnam's democracy became clear. On the home front, the birth of draft dodgers, civil disobedience, war protesters, and the like opposed the means of U.S. involvement in its affair. A conflict grew between those who protested the war and those who served in it. Clashing ideas about conscription and the responsibility to serve one's country led to one of the biggest anti-war movements in the history of the U.S. Emphasis was placed on the First Amendment rights, underlying how they are inalienable. These rights were challenged by opposition from the government. As the war persisted, the government struggled to find balance between their responsibilities to protect the country from communism and to uphold their citizens' natural rights. Ultimately, people at home viewed their rights as if they were violated, expressing their discontent through marches, public speeches, and acts of defiance. Subsequently, the U.S. government's undertaking to defend Vietnam led to a disservice in rights caused by the shadow of war. The Cold War ran rampant in the European and Asian Pacific theater. Belief of the domino theory, where if one country fell to communism, those around it would fall as well, warranted the establishment of a U.S. presence to combat its spread. A civil war in Vietnam between the communist-backed Viet Minh and democratic France led to the Geneva Accords Peace Conference of 1954. The conference divided Vietnam into a communist north and a democratic south. Tensions between these halves rose as the U.S. began to support the South in an effort to aid democracy. Lingering forethoughts about an upcoming war sparked discussions for military drafting and the beginning of its debate. Heading operations in the U.S. at this time was President John F. Kennedy. Generally speaking, Kennedy supported the draft system, openly defending its fairness to those starting to believe against it.
I cannot think of any branch of our government in the last 2 decades where there have been so few complaints about inequity.
However, his defense did little to ease the public's discontent. Many believed that war in Vietnam was imminent, and they would soon have an answer. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. The nation wept.
The President of the United States is dead.
Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson was soon sworn in as president, assuming Kennedy's control over U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Prior escalation influenced Johnson's view on a potential conflict. A provoked exchange of gunfire with the North Vietnamese Navy, known as the Gulf of Tonkin Incident, causes Johnson to promptly declare war with Vietnam. What followed Johnson's declaration was the initiation of the Vietnam Draft. The Vietnam War was not the first time a military draft was called. The draft was used previously in the Civil War, both World Wars, and Korea. Beginning in World War I, the Selective Service system managed the draft. Drafts were announced on and off over the years with conjugate federal selective service acts to mark the beginning of each draft. At the start of Vietnam, people were selected for the draft via local selective service draft boards. The boards drafted men between the ages of 18 to 26, with variations in the number of selectees, adhering to a quota set by the Selective Service. From 1941 to 1970, General Lewis B. Hershey was the director of the system. Some grew outraged as they were called into the draft boards for conscription. This outrage stemming from the fact that Americans want their right to freedom, to which the draft takes away in its principal function to enlist men. The men who were drafted could do little to oppose their selection. The little that could be done involved having a special exemption from the draft, deferments, entailed by a list created by the Selective Service. The other route taken by draftees was to dodge the draft, moving to another country, like Canada or Mexico. Selectees were not guaranteed the right to appeal themselves for exemption to the draft boards, raising questions about the constitutional policies in the Selective Service system. Nonetheless, a divide grew between those who resisted and those who intended to serve their country.
I mean, there was no doubt that I was going to serve my country. It was just a question of when. It was something that was instilled to both my sister, my younger sister, and myself. You know, there was no ifs, ands. If there was a war, we would go and we would serve in any way that we could.
My dad was really proud of me, you know, especially I went back to Nam, and he was real proud of me. You know, my mom and grandparents, everybody else was scared, thought something would happen to me. But,
The draft served as a means for Americans to carry out their responsibility to serve their country. The United States itself took responsibility with their efforts to defend democracy in Vietnam. Upon the time of aggression, the U.S. leapt forward to protect the free world. In the eyes of a combatant force, drafting soldiers seemed the best way to arrange a fighting force. Drafted soldiers would experience head-to-head combat, taking on the greatest risk and requiring the greatest courage. Some sacrificed their lives to enact their responsibility to serve their country. It is with this knowledge that those who resisted were seen in a different perspective.
I was in favor of fighting for my country, and they were like communists to me. You know, they were anti-American. They had their reasons. Some people were just scared. They don't want to die. How can you blame somebody for that, you know?
Being that this was the first ever war to be televised, many Americans had an insight into the horrible realities of it. The local media reported the death toll on both sides of the war daily, along with addressing the horrors and chaos of it. Questions about the need for American involvement arose as bloodshed in Vietnam continued.
I don't think the United States government should have the right to draft a person and send them to a war that doesn't directly affect the security of the United States.
Students in school began to have worried feelings about the draft.
I was kind of worried, you know. I knew all my friends were gone, and a lot of them wasn't coming back.
A sense of fear created in the media led many to look for the cause of it all, that being the draft.
So I felt the only thing for me to do was to stand up and say no publicly, and to join, help building a movement that is going to shut the Selective Service down permanently.
The first major anti-war protest in the U.S. sprung up due to this fear. Cities such as San Francisco, New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. grew synonymous for protesters. Public speeches held by figures such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Muhammad Ali painted the draft negatively.
My views on the draft are very clear. I'm against it.
So as the war hawks escalate the war in Vietnam, we must escalate our protest against the war.
The most definitive form of draft protesting was the burning of the draft card, a slip of paper acknowledging conscription. This act of defiance became the symbol for the Vietnam protest movements. Protesters took to burning their draft cards in public to make a symbolic statement in regards to their freedom. Soon enough, draft card burning was made a federal offense in 1965. Marking this form of protest illegal led to much backlash and argument in protesters. The argument being that burning your card was protected by the right to free speech in the First Amendment. Despite the illegalities of it, Americans around the country still burned their cards and conducted their protests. Burning your card wasn't just expressing opposition to the draft, it was expressing the will and right for American freedom. In 1966, David Paul O'Brien and fellow protesters stood in front of a Boston courthouse. Draft card in one hand and a lighter in the other, they soon set ablaze their conscription, protesting the Federal Draft Card Destruction Act from 1965. O'Brien would go against the Supreme Court in 1968 and state his case for reasons that the 1965 Act violates the right to free speech. The court disagreed with him, ruling that the criminalization of the destruction of a draft card was not infringing on this right. Despite the ruling, the anti-draft sentiment raged on. Responsibility was taken by the government in 1969 with the ending of Johnson's presidency and the election of Richard Nixon. Realizing the state of the country, taking account of protest, Nixon pushed for the ending of the draft. On November 26, 1969, he signed an amendment to the draft implementing a national lottery system. Nixon and other government officials believed that this was the best step to putting an end to it. Consolidating and regulating it would allow for direct changes to be made if the need be. On December 1st of that same year, the first ever televised lottery was held. Americans all over the country would tune in to see if they would be drafted. The lottery was seen as unfair in its statistical manner, being that it targeted men born in specific months. In 1970, Curtis W. Tarr became the successor to General Lewis B. Hershey. Assuming the role, Tarr began to fix the draft. He mostly focused on the statistical aspect of the draft and remodeled exemptions to it. The draft ended in 1973. The Vietnam War would end 2 years later. American soldiers came home to a different America, one scarred with the turmoils of protest and dissent.
How'd you feel about the ending of the war, like knowing that?
Oh man, when I heard that, I thought, what a waste.
It wasn't until after I got home that I really was subjected to anti-war seminism.
The Vietnam draft taught Americans that freedom is not to be taken for granted. Freedom is a right obtained through sacrifice. A right upheld by those at home haven't taken the responsibility to protect it by standing up and speaking out. The fight for those rights revealed that the government had acted mistakenly, but in the case of American spirit, those actions did not go unnoticed. The government took responsibility with their attempts of defending democracy and reforming the draft system, but it ultimately led to a disservice in rights. The military draft remains today, but in an idle state. seldom used after its tribulations from the Vietnam War.